around the, and Beaker is a good choice too, around the world. Yeah, this is great. So I hope you can hear me okay. You are here for the battle for online privacy. And as you see on the screen, I am Dan Moriarty. I am coming to you from the city of Minneapolis, where unfortunately we would have had our in-person DrupalCon this year, and where I think we would all be going out for a nice drink this evening. And instead, after I'm done today, I've got plans to cut my lawn. So, but that's equally important, I guess, or more. Here's a quick snapshot of me. This is my sort of my public persona these days. This is the first time I was out at a Target store wearing my face mask, and I like to show that I was wearing it upside down, but I figured that one out quickly. Real quickly about myself. So I've been doing web design for quite a long time, and Drupal as well, since early Drupal 6, late Drupal 5. I am on Twitter and Drupal, Minneapolis Dan, also sometimes known as Citizen Dan, because I work for an agency called Electric Citizen. We are based in Minneapolis, not coincidentally. We focus on the civic sector and are big Drupal advocates. We are also DrupalCon sponsors, as we have been the last few years. So when you're not at my talk, please feel free to stop by our booth and say hi. We don't have any live demos or anything, but we are monitoring the chat, so we'd be happy to chat with you there or say hello. All right, so I titled this talk The Battle, and I just thought, explain why did I choose to frame it this way? And I think it's because there's a feeling that our privacy, in the US and worldwide is under attack by some large and powerful forces and a small but strong group of individuals that are still trying to save it. But what kind of battle is it? The truth is that you could easily make the case it's a losing battle, or it has been so far, or that it's unwinnable. But hopefully by the end of this, we'll see there are some things that we can do. So sort of breaking down some of the key issues, threats to privacy first, before we get into solutions. I like to start with facial recognition. That one, perhaps one of the more recognizable, prominent dangers to privacy, or at least how you could see a danger to privacy with surveillance. When you hear facial recognition, you can being used to control people. You might think of repressive governments, like how China was using it against segments of their population. You wouldn't think necessarily of the United States, though, or Western democracies, right? But the truth is, facial recognition is being heavily adopted by law enforcement in this country, and it's run by for-profit companies, which have very little regulation on how or why or when they can use this technology. Recent events in the U.S. had companies like Microsoft and IBM and Amazon say they were taking a year off from supplying this technology to law enforcement, largely due to the well-known racial bias that's already inherent in facial recognition and false positives. But the truth is, they're not even the biggest players in that field. Japanese company NEC has been around for decades, and they're very active in supplying this technology to law enforcement across the country. Clearview AI, that you can see their little C icon there in the slide. I just give them a mention. You might want to look them up, but they're just an example of how essentially a one-person company managed to connect facial recognition with social profiles and data across the internet to profile millions of Americans, and they can sell that pretty much to anyone who asks because there's no regulation. So that's a concern. There's also data breaches. Data breaches get the big headlines sometimes, but they're really just a recurring, regular, almost daily occurrence. Everything from the Equifax data breach, where millions of people's credit reports records were stolen, including my own, maybe yours. The Yahoo data breach, I don't know, millions or a billion user accounts, including my own. The infamous Cambridge Analytica breach, where people were unwittingly sharing their contacts information, and their personal information was then used to target the same people in ads. Apparently there's a, oh yes, that's a good comment, Chris. There, just saw that on my phone before I started that there has been more data breaches in terms of Twitter accounts of some famous people like Bill Gates. I haven't seen what the damage from that is, but hopefully not too bad. I also saw Kanye on that list, which I wasn't as concerned about. All right, but it's not just malicious hackers. It's also, you know, it's part of our economy, this practice of buying and selling private data. And some of it's legitimate, like, you know, you're applying for a house, a bank wants to know if you're credit worthy. So checking your credit history seems like a legitimate exercise, but a lot of it is not. And a lot of it is just opening us to risk and potential abuse in terms of, for example, data being used by the government to target illegal immigrants, or people using search for stalkers or abusers, or trying to influence your vote, or practicing racial or income-based discrimination. So that can all be part of this data exchange as well. But the point is, just like with facial recognition, there's very little regulation, and yet there's billions at stake. And it's also, it's not just companies, it's things. It's all these smart things that we know and love and use, right? It's everything from your Nest device reporting back, you know, when you're awake and moving about the house, you know, your Sonos device reporting what you like to listen to. I find Roku an interesting example because I use Roku, I like them, but you know, they don't even consider themselves a streaming company or a technology company. They consider themselves an advertising company. And the reason for that is their whole profit model is we're tracking everything you're doing in streaming, which we're doing a lot of these days, at least everyone I know, and using that to target you with ads. And now car companies are looking to get in on the data, tracking where you drive and how you live your life. You know, we're at Drupal WebCon. It's DrupalCon Global. It's also the internet. It's us. It's the websites we build, the data we manage, the information we collect, the tracking scripts we enable. Like, we're all part of this ecosystem. And there are things that we can talk about later that we can do to sort of be better citizens with that data. I just want to give a quick highlight here. I should check how I'm doing for time. For this author, Shoshanna Zubov, and her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I just want to give it a quick shout out. Either check it out, read it. It's a fairly substantial book, or just try to listen to her on a podcast. But in a nutshell, what her argument is that, you know, we're entering this new age, which she termed surveillance capitalism. So in the US in the late 19th century, we had this dynamic, or this term called the robber barons, where there was only a few individuals that controlled all the power because they controlled the raw natural resources. And she's making the very intelligent argument that today there's also a small number of individuals or companies that control have a lot of the control by controlling the resources. But in this time, it's not lumber or coal they're controlling, it's our human experiences, our behavior, our private thoughts and behaviors. And these are the new raw materials, and we give it away for free. All right. So I prepared this little graph just to give you a quick rundown of how this works. So you can picture yourself or the general public on the left side of the slide, and then a company, let's say Google or something, on the right. And they're offering us these free low-cost apps and services, which are very useful. I use them. I'm not above using them. They're great. But part of the contract is that once you have them, they start tracking your data. That's how they make their money. But what isn't as maybe as considered is that part of that is they're extracting your private data, and that's everything from, you know, your thoughts, your daily lives, where you're shopping, what your opinions, your voting. and sending it back to these same companies, right? And in doing so, a little hesitation in my slide going forward. There we go. Then they in turn are selling your private data to all these, either using it themselves or selling it to these other data brokers. They're making a ton of money doing so. Again, this is data that we provide for free, for nothing. And then we get this dynamic with us, the people, or the people in the middle, right? And on one side, you've got company extracting your private data and making money. And the other side, you've got companies targeting you with your own private data, again, trying to influence you and really just leaving you as this, giant target. So in summary, this has been a really fast moving change. In a sense, it really is centered around Google and how they've managed to create this whole ecosystem of surveillance. Everything from your browser, your Android device, your Google Maps, your email, your Gmail, right? Google Docs. And other companies couldn't help but notice. Facebook became part of this. Microsoft and Amazon. There are many others, but these are some of the big players. And what's the big deal? Well, it's not just about knowing your secrets. Having that power it's about managing people and populations. But what choice do we have, right? It's so much part of our daily lives. It's really hard to sort of extract yourself from this dynamic. We're using maps to find our way. We're using the internet to find jobs, to dating sites to find a partner. So it's really hard to sort of separate yourself from that. And so one approach is just to accept it. Just say, hey, privacy's over, it's dead, and just get over it. So those are the dangers. And now let's talk about how some people are saying, no, there is still something we can do. And let's start with privacy law, which has come along to help try and stop this slide. I should add that, of course, but I am not a lawyer, but I'm going to talk about the law just in summary. So GDPR, there's great talks and articles that go into vast detail about these laws. So I'm just going to give you the quick summary. I love this thread going on as I'm speaking too. So the GDPR, right? The General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. It's been around for over 2 years now. And at its essence, it's all about saying users have rights to their personal data and companies have an obligation to protect that data. All right, so I've seen different summaries of the law in different areas, but here's my take on a summary of it, of the main components. So one is breach notification. When you have those data breaches, you have to, as an organization, have a plan to tell people what to do, what happens next. You have to give users access to their personal data, easy access. Users have a right to be forgotten, which, as you know, means I can request my personal data be deleted from this site, Drupal.org or whatever, and they have to do it. Data portability, so I have to be the right to request all the personal data you've been holding on me that you've gathered over the years and get an export of that and take it wherever I want. And to their credit, Facebook has met this requirement fairly well. If you've ever tried it, you get like a little mini static HTML site that you download and has everything, or at least a lot. And then privacy, lastly, privacy by design, this concept that, instead of this opt-out culture where you have to find some line in a privacy policy that says, I don't want to be tracked, let's change that dynamic so it's, I need to opt in. All right, so who does the GDPR affect? It's any size organization, which might be surprising to some people, for-profit and nonprofit, serving EU users. For EU users, for someone in the United States, you might not think that applies to you. However, anyone living in an EU nation that accesses your site, or an American living abroad in an EU nation that's accessing your site would be covered. So what's happened since this law has taken effect? Well, there's been a crap load of fines, which is good, I guess. You know, it has some teeth. This number I'm displaying is sort of depending on whether you take into account some of these cases that are still pending resolution. But assuming that they do resolve, we're getting upwards of 500 billion. And it's not just EU corporations, it's international. So what has this led to else? This has also led to this renewed focus on what makes for a good privacy experience, which we're going to look at next. And it's also led directly to new laws in the USA. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Ccpa, the California Consumer Privacy Act. It is state law as of January 1st this year. Anyone out there notice a flurry of emails towards the end of last year or the beginning of this year with all the organizations that might have your email address saying, hey, we updated our privacy policy, blah, 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 come check it out. I got a ton of those, and I will be first to admit I did not go read all of them, but that was a lot to do with the Ccpa becoming law. And again, a quick summary of what this is. It's all about users' rights. You need to know if personal data is being collected. You need to know if it's being sold to others. You need to be able to opt out, request your data be deleted, right? A right to be forgotten. You need to not be discriminated against for exercising your rights, which I particularly enjoy that one. It says if I say, no, I don't want to be tracked, I should still be able to use your web service. Unlike the GDPR, this one is just for profit companies, so nonprofits get a pass. Doing business in California, but again, it's not hard to imagine you get visitors from other states or someone who is a resident in California visits your site while they're living somewhere else. So the scope is broader than you might think. It also means you have to have revenue over 25 million. So small businesses are mostly exempt. However, if you collect personal info of over 50,000 people, you know, a year, you also are obligated to comply. And you might think that's even a high number, but if you think, well, I'm running a site, a blog that gets 10,000 visitors a year or a month, and I'm running analytics, I'm collecting data, you meet that threshold really quickly. It's also anyone who earns more than half their revenue selling personal information also must comply. So quick summary of how you meet these requirements. Have reasonable security procedures and practices in place, how you're going to deal with data breach. Give users this opt-out process, make it easy to understand, and request a copy of their data. That one particular requirement is one that a lot of companies are finding hard and expensive to do, but they're trying to comply. And ask to be forgotten, and update your privacy policies. Make these easier to understand. If you might have visitors to your site under the age of 13, then you need to ask parental consent before you are tracking them. How would you know what age they are? Well, that's a whole another question. But what's happened since this law has taken effect? It's only been what? I can do the math. 7 months. So, well, there hasn't been a ton of fines yet. There have been some. But there has been billions spent on compliance. So companies are really spending a lot, hiring other firms to meet this compliance, and scrambling to make their private data accessible to users in terms of being able to download it or even just view it. And that's where there's been a lot of money being spent. But what's perhaps more interesting or more compelling is that this also has led to other states considering their own privacy acts. And I haven't updated this list since I researched this last year, so I don't know what's exactly changed on this list, but just know that there are other states considering their own privacy laws. And you can see then, or start to see how this might be a problem. It's like, if every state in the country, if we're talking just the United States, has their own privacy laws, how are you as a site owner going to develop your policies to match each one? So it would seem that a federal privacy law is the next step. But in this election cycle, it's not really being talked about. Early on, there was maybe one candidate talking about it, but it's really not being discussed. And given the pandemic and other things going on, it's probably on the back burner. But it seems like this is the way it has to go and be resolved. And the world's bigger than the EU and the United States, right? There's other great countries out there, and they have their own privacy laws. And guess what? You're supposed to be complying with those too. From Canada to Australia, Brazil, there's others. So it's really becoming a tangled web and something that I feel like a lot of us are behind on and need to start catching up. So how does this relate to websites in Drupal? Well, like I just said, starting to if you work with websites, how are you going to start meeting these laws and requirements? One of the great steps you can take, regardless of whether you are liable or for legal reasons or not, is to adopt something called privacy experience, or PX for short. So just like as web builders, we've adapted over the years to things like accessibility, better UX, responsive design. PX is yet just another stage, another phase to projects that we need to consider. All right, so here's a very simplified version of the web design process as it exists today for a lot of us, right? We start with a plan, our discovery phase. We move on to design and UX. We get into web development, the build, and then the launch. And in that four-step process, again, very simplified, when is privacy considered for most companies? In my experience, it's been at that last phase, the launch phase. It's like, oh crap, we need a privacy policy. Let's cut and paste something or reuse what we had and throw it up there, right? So at no point is it considered beforehand. What the privacy experience, the PX addition to your build goes, is it adds this new stage to each of those main phases where we're considering privacy. So in that planning phase, we're thinking about what data are we collecting? How can users opt in and out? How are we protecting personal information? How are we making it portable? So this stuff takes planning. It doesn't just happen, right? When we get to the design phase, how are we making this visible to the user and easy to access whatever tools we're providing? When we get to the web development phase, how are web developers handling data as they're building the site? What tools do we need to add? And then lastly, of course, at launch, what privacy policies are we putting up? And post-launch, what's our data breach procedures? So these are all considerations that can be added to your website project. Not without work, but worth considering. So again, planning for user privacy and security, considering it part of your build. It's not, this is extra work, right? Or it might seem that way. So maybe you need to start budgeting for it. I know that we've been asked over the years to budget more for accessibility, although that seems to become now just part of what we do. Budget for performance. So maybe start budgeting some extra hours or asking for them for privacy as part of your build. And by the way, thank you for all the comments and discussion going on. I am sort of zoned in on my presentation, so if you're asking questions, I will try to get to them at the end here. Just real quickly, this term gets thrown about a lot, but PII, or personal identifying information, that's the kind of information that we're trying to protect. What do we mean by that? Some of it's obvious, things like your name, social security number, that's would be sort of a no-brainer. But if you combine certain fields with the ones on the right, like where you live or your employer, that can become more sensitive information. One of the items on that list that you might not consider PII is your IP address. While that's sort of an anonymous tool that's used in tracking, it has been shown there's techniques for sort of associating that with a particular user and as they browse the web. So that by definition in this is considered PII. All right, so what do you do? Again, set clear policies. Consider adopting an opt-in to data collection, not opt-out dynamic. You know, you're going to need documentation how you're collecting this data, what your processes are. Consider setting expiration dates on your data that you're collecting. How long are you keeping it? Do you need this forever? You know, probably not. Make it easier for users to be forgotten if that is what they wish. All right, and have a strong privacy policy, and don't wait to the end of the project to do that. Ideally, you can work with a lawyer to help you craft that, but not everyone has the resources or access to do so. There are some privacy policy creators out there. I can't testify to which one is better than the other, but I did some exploring, and it looks like at least there's some customized level to these services. If you just search the web for them, where you give them some data about what you're collecting, they kind of gather that information and then help you generate a policy. At least it's a good start. Speaking of privacy policies, these have really been sort of a false choice for us as consumers over the years, as like, well, it's all covered there, just go read it. Because as most of us know, these are things we don't read, and for good reason. They're very difficult to read. This little graph here I'm showing you is sort of pinpointing on a graph a scale of hard to read on the left versus minutes to read. And some major companies listed their privacy policies. So you can see a company like Airbnb, maybe this has improved in the last 6 months, but they would fall under the 35, 40 minutes to read, and requires like that upper college level reading level to understand it. Whereas only a few, like the BBC, falls in that short to read and easier to understand. Right, like terms of services too, who reads those? And this little overlay kind of highlights this even clearer. It shows you where the dots are falling. So at that bottom level is the middle school reading level, and really that's what you should be striving for. We expecting people to have a college level degree of reading, or even worse or better, however you want to phrase it, but a professional privacy policy reader, aka lawyer, is required by so many of these, and it just hasn't been a good choice. And what's more, studies have shown, a study done well over 10 years ago showed it would take an average person about 300 hours a year just to read the privacy policies for those sites that they're used to visiting. And that was, well, actually 12 years ago, when we use the internet a lot less, if you can believe it. We're like 3 times that now in our internet use. So just triple that number, and you can see how it's just been an impossible task to expect people to keep up with the privacy policies. And yes, I don't blame anyone for not reading them. It's just horrible. So one of the last thoughts on this section I just wanted to highlight is, accessibility isn't required everywhere yet either, or at least that's debatable. But we do it because A, it's the right thing to do, and B, because we do believe it will be required everywhere soon anyway. And so I kind of start to apply that same dynamic to thinking about privacy and how we need to start thinking and approaching that in the near future. All right. Yeah, I haven't read the Drupal.org privacy link. I just saw that comment. That's a good question. I like Drupal, so I'll give them a long pass if they're not meeting it yet. So for this last section, let's talk about some technical issues as it relates to privacy and some tools we could use, or thoughts about how we might use them. Let's grab a quick drink. All right, so when we're talking websites, we're talking developers, right? People, the great people who build our sites, and what is we need to involve them in this process. How are we planning to manage data? How are we planning to measure whatever privacy impact the things that we do might have? Under GDPR rules, if you are at a certain level or security level, you're required to write a more formal statement called a privacy impact assessment, a living document where you're auditing and inventorying all the privacy risks. You don't have to go that far for a lot of us, but just start documenting and thinking about this. So when we're talking about managing data, if you're like our agency and a lot of people, your developers are working locally, right? We have the sites off on a server that the public sees, but when we work with the sites, we're grabbing a copy of all the code and data and bringing it to our local machines where we can work on it. And it's more efficient, it's a great process. As we're doing this process, we might be pulling down all this personal information in our records. And, I'm not saying, you're not trustworthy, but maybe stop and ask yourself, what kind of data, how sensitive is this data that you're working with? Do you need those specific records? Because developers really don't have any problem using fake data. So maybe that's an opportunity where certain private records get wiped as you download that local copy. And there are some tools that help with that. And also, how often are you purging it? Do you need these specific records? Data on the server itself, there's levels of protection, but depending on the sensitivity of the information, maybe the entire database needs to be encrypted. And then from a content and marketing standpoint, ask yourself, what data are you collecting? Do you need everything that you're asking for? A frequent argument is, well, we don't know. We might need it in the future, so let's just get it all now. But the good privacy experience voice in your head would then say, well, no, let's limit our exposure and limit their exposure to a data breach. All right, let's talk cookies. So you probably have seen, ever since the GDPR took effect, these cookie banners, right? Everywhere you go, you see the little banner, hey, this site uses cookies, and then a big fat button that will typically say, I agree, right? I don't know what this banner is telling me, but sure, I'll agree, because then this banner will go away. Because honestly, it's a UX problem too, especially on mobile, to have half your screen taken up by these banners. But there is a value to them in that you're trying to share with users what data you're collecting. And it's really not enough to just say, you accept, and that's your only choice. To honor the spirit of the law or to comply with the law, you need to be able to offer people choices. And when it comes to cookies, just quickly mention, we're talking different types of cookies. So there's functional cookies. You need a cookie that manages user state. So when I'm logged in or I'm doing a shopping cart, the site won't function without it. So that's sort of functional and not really optional. But then, are you agreeing to be tracked as you leave that site and go on to every other site you visit for the next week? Probably not, but that can be a cookie too. So how do you deal with that? Well, there's this nice module on Drupal.org called EU Cookie Compliance. It's one that we've used. This little screenshot is just an example. I was just playing around with some newer features of that, where you can start to define not only the cookies, but the individual categories of cookies, and then set preferences, which ones you agree to and which ones you don't. I needed to do some more theming, styling work on this, but that's a great option. There's also third-party integrations you can explore where they'll take care of all the code work, and you just pay them and then implement their script on your site, things like CookieBot. And there's modules that in Drupal that work with that as well. I just wanted to highlight, I think what is kind of a nicer user experience when it comes to these cookie banners. For example, this MailChimp screenshot where I get the banner, I can click accept, or I can go for more information, and that brings up this little modal window where they're explaining, ideally in plain language, here's what we're using cookies for. And then there's categories, our essential cookies that you can't opt out of. But then there's things like advertising and analytics, and you make the case why this is valuable. I think you might think users will automatically opt out, and in some cases they might, because it's no one wants to be tracked for indefinitely. But sometimes if you just explain why you're tracking, users might agree to it, and it's just a healthier dynamic privacy experience. All right, so site analytics. Almost everyone uses site analytics on their sites. Google Analytics is the most widely used. You know, do they collect private personal identifying information, PII? Well, according to the GDPR, they do. So if you're using that, you want to comply. I'm not sure about the CCPA, to be honest, but you know, this is a common practice in privacy experiences. You tell people not only the advertising tracking, but analytics as well. Google is designed this to track anonymous users, right? But through events and other marketing techniques, remarketing techniques, personal data can get in there. It is a violation of Google's terms, but they're not necessarily monitoring every million sites that's using analytics out there. So, and it also can tie, you know, users to sort of generalized data that's somewhat private, right? Like you can say your age or your region or your profession. And in GDPR terms, Google Analytics stores an online identifier and a cookie, which is why it needs to be mentioned in here to be compliant. Also, I just mentioned there is an open source options like Matomo, where you're hosting the analytics yourself, and then you're sort of avoiding that dynamic or worry about data abuse. If you're talking a web conference, most of us are using web form module, which is great. There's nothing I'm saying is against that. But again, what data are you collecting and for how long? You know, when you have your contact form, keep the number of fields to a minimum. Explain why, or try to, maybe a better user experience is explaining if you ask for like age or region or job or title, explain why you're asking for these and then let the user decide. And limit what you collect. You could consider, I don't believe the module has this feature to automatically do this, but you could write scripts or just have scheduled practices where you go in and delete the data regularly, just to not be hoarding all that private data on your server. All right, just a few more slides here. Third-party scripts. So if you're working with Drupal on the command line, you've used Composer, or you use the npm library, and when you run those, you get dozens. It's like going through all the privacy policies in your life, right? You're just seeing these dozens of things, and you're just like, sure, I agree to them, whatever. But how do you know that what they're doing with the data? There is an opportunity to insert a script that can track user data in those things you're downloading. So who's watching those? I honestly don't know. And if there's a security issue or a breach, how would you know? So I'm not saying don't use them, but it's just highlighting that this is kind of a gray area, a blind spot, I think, for privacy and something worth further exploring. Social and sharing widgets. By the way, I will provide a link for the slides at the end here. You know, those little widgets that you add maybe to a blog post that says, share this post, this article on my Facebook feed or Twitter, right? And that's great. They're convenient. But what you may not realize is just by putting those little widgets on your site, those little widgets are tracking your users and not for you, for themselves. And that extends beyond once they leave your site, right? So one way to consider avoiding that or alleviating that is to maybe roll your own. I don't know of another choice at this point, but just be aware that these helpful little free widgets sometimes come with privacy cost. Similarly, a YouTube video player, you put that on your page, you can, it's convenient, but did you know that without even me choosing to play that video, the second that page loads, it's tracking me now too. So, maybe instead of the player, you just show a still video, an image from the video, and the user at least has to consent to want to watch it before they start getting tracked. At least that's a little better, right? And I guess lastly, my takeaway is be privacy smart. So encryption is your number one tool, and not incognito mode. That's not it. But encryption of data is our number one privacy supporting surveillance fighting tool. I just want to highlight really quick, there's something out there called the Earn It legislation. Look into it and consider whether you support that or not. It's the government trying to force companies like Apple and others to give them backdoors to their encryption data. And if they don't, they'll take away some of the liability protections that exist, something called the 230 exemption. So look into that. Consider using browsers like DuckDuckGo or search engines. For search engine, it works great. It's not, I won't say it's good as Google, but it's 80, 90% of the way there. So for your general daily use, just use it and participate less in the tracking, right? Consider Firefox browser or Brave. Consider Proton Mail instead of Gmail, where they're tracking and reusing your private data. Support advocacy organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, ACLU, and continue to do what a lot of you do already, which is support open source in the open web. So lastly, just a quick rundown. The GDPR compliance team has done a great job. I got pretty much this whole list from their page on Drupal.org of modules that privacy related that you will want to check out. I already talked about the cookie compliance one. There's other ones I'll just quickly highlight. The encrypt module for working with other libraries to encrypt your database, things like the cryptolog module or IP anonymize to anonymize IP addresses. Blizz Vanisher prevents these things like your YouTube video players from rendering content until the users agreed to watch that, or Faker, which helps work with auto data generating scripts to replace that personal data you might be working with, or Garter security distribution, which comes with extra layers of security preventing data breaches. So just lastly, thank you for sticking with me this long on this beautiful day. Final takeaways, does privacy still matter? I think one of my key lessons that I want to share with you is just avoid getting comfortably numb. It's really easy to say, well, privacy is dead, just get over it. There's nothing I can do. Try to understand these new laws and best practices. Start trying to bring them into your projects and to your clients, and recognize that all of us can have a role to play in making this a healthier web environment for everyone. All right, so with that, I've got a few minutes left, and I'm happy to stay on afterwards to try and answer some of your questions. So thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you listening to me, and I hope you got something out of this. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try and scroll up here on this thread to see if there's any questions. And here, I'll do this real quick. My slides. Site evaluation. Boom, boom, boom. I apologize. There's a lot of scrolling here to find any questions, so feel free to try to fire them off to me again. I'll see if I can answer. What's my opinion of PI whole? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'll have to look that one up. There's so much to learn. I'm in it to learn it. Let's see. Pre-checked opt-in checking boxes for non-essential cookies are not allowed. Yes, that's absolutely true. Using Firefox is great. Talking about that Twitter. Only ask questions of users you really need, which is great. Separation of data collected on what one might sell for a profit and what a business owner might collect for their own records. I think legally, that's a good question. If it's a question of trying to comply with like something like the CCPA, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know that I can answer to that level, but I would think if you're selling data for profit, then you have to comply with that law. And if you're collecting invoices and client names, it doesn't seem like that would fall under that category. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here again, see if there are any other questions. Looks like there was. Oh, thank you, Terry. Yeah, I'm glad I did this talk at MidCamp earlier. That was, I've tried to kind of refine it, tighten it up. I was a bit scrambling for time in that one, but glad you saw both. Yeah, VPNs are great. I'd like to hear all your thoughts on them. I honestly I'm a little limited on my knowledge there. There's the link for that Sean shared. Thank you. Some Drupal modules to audit privacy. So that's a good one too. Someone had asked me, you know, since there's these tools for automated accessibility checks, is there, you know, like at the Axe plugin, is there something like that for privacy? Not that I have seen. There are paid services that will do this for you, where they'll go in and audit your site, see what cookies and scripts and whatnot you're using, and then get back to you and say, here's the privacy concerns and what we see. So there's definitely paid services. I have not seen automated tools around that. And there's a nice tip here from Newt. If you need to embed something from YouTube, you can enable privacy enhanced mode. That's great to know. I did not know that at all. So thank you for that tip. How to combat the proliferation of free tools. Most people don't seem to care. I know, and I'll own up to my own complicit behavior in this, right? Like, I'm speaking to you in Chrome right now. I think I tried to get away from that at the last time I did this kind of thing, and I had technical issues, and so I just said, all right, I'm just going to go with what they recommend. And as a company, you know, we still use Gmail and Google Docs, so it's a process. It's a process getting away from it. It's just, it's raising awareness. It's a journey. Let's see. Appreciate all the tips that are coming in here and comments. Again, I just really will add that this just seems to be sort of an evolving thing that we're all kind of growing into and learning about. And I see it as something that hopefully, ideally, in my opinion, for sure, I feel it will happen, is that we'll all be needing to really up our privacy game in the near future and making that part of our projects. And yes, not only support these organizations that I mentioned, but contact your legislator, especially around the Earn It legislation. That's a dangerous one, forcing companies that have tried to hold the line for encryption and sort of try to force their hand. So look that one up and let's see what we can do. And hopefully we'll see some more privacy topics in the next year here, right? Because clearly a lot of us care about it, and that's really encouraging. Congress member, yes, good catch. All right. Well, it looks like the questions are kind of caught up here, so I'm happy to stay on. A privacy buff, yeah. If maybe if someone wants to organize it, I will be there. Otherwise, if I have time, I will try to do one. If there's interest, and hit me up on the chat. And again, stop by our there. I don't know. Is there a privacy Drupal Slack channel? That would be great. I am pretty slacked out as far as channels go these days, but yes, that would be one worth looking into. Someone could start it, yes. All right, well, I'm gonna go get started on getting ready for the next session, and I hope to see you all in the chat as we continue on tomorrow. And again, stop by the Electric Citizen booth and say hi, and appreciate all of you very much.